Well, thank you for joining tonight or this afternoon. I'm going to be talking about the Bloomsbury Group on a forum entitled The Long 19th Century, so it's stretching it a bit. But I want to argue that the Bloomsbury Group, which was the most influential between the wars, had its roots in the age of Victoria and can be seen as a reaction against it, so is arguably a relevant topic for discussion. If you feel that this talk for the long 19th century is more long than 19th century, feel free to drop out and catch up later. It's divided into 6 unequal chunks to make that possible. Okay, so the title slide. So what is Bloomsbury, or Bloomsbury in a nutshell? Let's begin with a quick summary. Most obviously, it's a place and it's in London, and it's famous for the British Museum and tree-lined squares surrounded by tall and beautiful Georgian houses. It's also a literary and artistic circle, better known today as the group name for the area's most famous 20th century residents, a collection of British artists, writers, intellectuals, including Virginia Woolf, E.M. Foster, John Maynard Keynes, whose anti-establishment views changed the course of modern culture. The members of the Bloomsbury Group promoted free verse and free love. They promoted post-impressionist art and published books via the Hogarth Press. They jokingly called themselves the Bloomsburys after this name was given to them in 1912, but they'd been meeting together long before that to discuss matters of art, literature, culture and politics, as this still from the BBC mini TV series Life in Squares illustrates. And they were doing so well into the 20th century. This painting of the Memoir Club, begun in 1920 and continuing to meet until 1964, was painted by Vanessa Bell in 1943. It depicts Duncan Grant, Leonard Woolf, Vanessa Bell, Clive Bell, David Garnett, Maynard and Lydia Keynes, Desmond and Molly McCarthy, Quentin Bell and E.M. Foster. And if you look very carefully, on the wall behind are painted portraits of past members of the group, Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey and Roger Fry, all who had died by then. And Bloomsbury is also the name given to arguably the most influential movement in art, literature and thought between the wars. It's represented here by a detail of Vanessa Bell's painting of a studio at Charleston in Sussex. And you can't, of course, mention Bloomsbury without quoting the American wit and poet Dorothy Parker, who famously summed up Bloomsbury as living in squares, painting in circles and loving in triangles. Bloomsbury then could also be used to define a state of mind, a commitment to living by your own sense of values with your own freedom and independence. Bohemianism for posh people, if you like. Amy License's book, by the way, is a good introduction. And that's one section over already. The second section is about Bloomsbury's Victorian origins. So how can I justify this as 19th century? So let us begin at the beginning. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful princess, Julia Princep Jackson. Here seen in a photograph by her aunt, the celebrated photographer and friend of Tennyson and the Pre-Raphaelites, Julia Margaret Cameron. Julia Jackson was born in 1846 in Kolkata, or Calcutta as it was known then, the 4th child of a wealthy and well-connected family of merchants. Her mother was a beauty from the famous, beautiful Patel family, whom Ruskin described as Elgin marbles with dark eyes. It was clear that Julia Jackson was to inherit some of this beauty, as a whole series of photographs by her aunt Julia Margaret Cameron show. This photograph was taken in 1867 when she was aged 21, the year in which she married her first husband, Herbert Duckworth. This picture was also taken in 1867, a year after she had modelled for Edward Burne-Jones as the Princess Sabra led to be sacrificed to the dragon in this picture. Like her aunt, she was well known to the Pre-Raphaelite circle. By 1879, when she was again the model for Burne-Jones, Herbert Duckworth had been dead for 9 years. This is a detail from his painting of the Annunciation. By then, Julia Duckworth, née Jackson, had met and married Leslie Stephen. He was the foremost literary editor of his day, at the time the editor of the Cornhill magazine, and from 1882, the editor of the 26-volume Dictionary of National Biography, for which he wrote many entries himself. His own literary connections were almost impeccable. In 1872, he had married Harriet Minnie Thackeray, the picture on the left, the youngest daughter of the famous Victorian novelist and friend of Dickens, best known for Vanity Fair. Minnie Thackeray had died of a seizure in 1875 when pregnant and suffering from preeclampsia. They had been living with Annie Thackeray, and when Minnie, Leslie and Annie moved to 11 Hyde Park Gate, south in Kensington, next door to Julia Jackson, or Julia Duckworth as she was then, they married on the 26th of March 1878, a year after Annie Thackeray had married her cousin. This was near Stephen's family home at 14 Hyde Park Gate. He was the son of a distinguished colonial Undersecretary of State and abolitionist, Sir James Stephen, a leading light in what was known as the Clapham set. This was an early 19th century group of mainly evangelical Christian social reformers. Leslie had a distinguished academic career at Eton, King's College London and Trinity Hall, Cambridge. He was ordained and became a tutor at Cambridge, but lost his faith after reading Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. He became one of the leading humanists of his day before that term was used. He was also known as a successful and talented alpinist. Fans of Thomas Hardy, as I know there are some here, will know the story of him reading Under the Greenwood Tree and writing to Hardy to offer a publication of a later novel to the Cornhill magazine. This would be Far from the Madding Crowd. And as I always tell visitors to the cottage, it nearly didn't happen because on a very wet day, the postman gave a bundle of letters to the local children and they ran down the lane and it poured down, and the one letter they dropped in the mud was the one from Leslie Stephen. Now, if that had been a Hardy novel, it'd still be there today and he would have died in the garret, but I of course digress. Hardy and Stephen remained friends. Unlike George Eliot earlier, Hardy was a frequent visitor. Stephen in his younger days had been one of the greatest Victorian climbers, and Hardy wrote this poem in 1897, The Shreckhorn, which with its reference to quaint glooms, keen lights and rugged trim, and the eternal essence of his mind compared to the adamantine shape of the mountain he was first to scale in 1861, says a lot about the man. It was a tribute. And here they are with one of the 4 children they had together, Virginia Stephen, later, of course, the famous novelist Virginia Woolf. The picture was taken at Talland House, St. Ives, the house leased by Leslie Stephen in 1881 and the family's holiday home every June to October from the year of Virginia's birth in 1882 to the death of Julia Jackson in 1895. This picture was probably taken in 1892 when Virginia was about 10. And here are father and daughter a few years later. For her and her siblings, Vanessa, born in 1879, Toby in 1880, and Adrian, born in 1883, he was a formidable figure. Her feelings towards her parents can best be seen in the characters of the Ramsays in her most famous novel, To the Lighthouse, published in 1927. Mr. Ramsay, quick-tempered, rude, wrapped up in himself and in need of constant praise. Mrs. Ramsay, beautiful, kind, caring, self-sacrificial and tolerant, the devoted and submissive angel in the house, as set out in Coventry Patmore's poem, which was held by many Victorians as the ideal of womanhood. As in the novel, Talland House welcomed many distinguished visitors, such as the author Henry James, James Russell Lowell, the American poet and ambassador and Virginia's godfather, and the poet George Meredith. From the windows of their bedrooms, the children could clearly see the Godrevy Lighthouse, which inspired the book's title, even though she moved the location of her novel to the Isle of Skye off the west coast of Scotland. Virginia, as we have seen, was not the only child. Here are the 4 children of Julia and Leslie Stephen at Talent House in 1892. Vanessa, Virginia and Toby, with an earlier picture of Virginia and Adrian above that of Vanessa and Virginia, also playing cricket. They were, though, not the only children in the family. Julia brought 3 children with her from her previous marriage. The man in the bowler hat is Horatio Brown, a visitor to the house, but the other 2 young men next to a tired-looking Julia are George Duckworth, born in 1868, and Gerald Duckworth, born in 1870. Not illustrated are Julia's daughter Stella Duckworth, born in 1870, and Laura Stevens, the only child of Leslie Stevens' previous marriage, also born in 1870. She was the daughter of Minnie Thackeray. She had a developmental disability, possibly Downs or a form of autism, and was always treated as an outsider by the other children. They referred to her as the Lady of the Lake. She lived at home with a German nurse until 1891, when she was moved to Brook House in Southgate under the care of a Dr. Corner. She lived for another 54 years. It was also while staying at Talent House that 6-year-old Virginia was the victim of a sexual assault by her 18-year-old half-brother, Gerald, on the right there. If Talent House was, with this one exception I've just mentioned, a haven of light and sea air, the Kensington home of 22 Hyde Park Gate had the dark interiors associated with so many Victorian homes. It became even more dark and gloomy when Julia Jackson, Duckworth, Stephen, worn out by child rearing and a life of caring for others, died at the age of 49 in 1895. Her last words to 13-year-old Virginia, "Hold yourself straight, my little goat," contain both the affectionate nickname and a sort of rigid concern for propriety that the Bloomsbury Group would later rebel against. As her father approached her, she stretched out her arms, but he ignored her and brushed past. The death of her mother would trigger the first of the 5 nervous breakdowns and suicide attempts in Virginia's life. With the death of their mother, the burden of care and the pacifying of the increasingly irascible and emotionally dependent Leslie Stephen fell first on 26-year-old Stella, seen here, in between Vanessa and Virginia. She married Jack Hills in 1897, but she died of peritonitis only 3 months later. The role of the angel of the house, keeper of the family purse, Leslie wanted every penny spent accounted for, and pacifier of her father passed then to Vanessa, now 28. It was not a role to be envied. Can I just ask, are you just seeing my slides on the screen?
Oh, yes. If we hadn't been, I would have said, yes.
Thank you.
Everything's great.
We're on to section 3 already. Doesn't time fly when you're enjoying yourself? An escape to Cambridge. For Toby, on the other hand, 1899 offered an escape to Cambridge from the oppressive atmosphere of his Kensington home. And 1899 is the first of the 3 most important dates for the birth of Bloomsbury, as we shall see. When Toby arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, at the start of the Michaelmas term in 1899, seen here on the right, it was still very much a male preserve. The picture on the left, taken in 1897, shows a riot of male undergraduates protesting about a proposed vote to allow women to be awarded degrees, even though the first women's college, Girton, had opened in 1869. The first Cambridge PhD would be awarded to a woman in 1924. Oxford, you will perhaps be pleased to know, would be awarding degrees to women for a good 4 years before then. Cambridge did not regularly confer degrees on women until as late as 1948. As well as Toby, there were other key figures in the Bloomsbury set who would go up to Trinity in the same year. Shown here are Toby Stephen at the top, Lytton Strachey, Saxon Sidney Turner, Clive Bell, Leonard Woolf. Adrian Stephen would follow 3 years later. Here began the intellectual dinners and conversations that would later be mirrored in the meetings which took place in the squares of Bloomsbury. There are a number of such groups, but the foremost of these were the secret society known as the Apostles, or the Conversazioni Society, supposedly the 12 cleverest students at Cambridge at any one time. Potential new recruits would be carefully observed on their entry to the university, and if deemed suitably intellectual, would be invited to join this discussion group held on Saturday nights. There were only 3 new appointees of apostles each year. Of Toby's friends, Leonard Woolf, Lytton Strachey, Saxon Sidney Turner, and Leonard Woolf, so I mentioned him already, were invited to join those already there. Roger Fry, John Maynard Keynes, Desmond McCarthy, and E.M. Foster, who would all later be mainstays of the Bloomsbury Group, and they were already members. Other members included Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, a key influence on Bloomsbury, and occasionally Ludwig Wittgenstein. E.M. Foster, pictured here. Members of the Apostles were sworn to secrecy and loyal to one another. This may account for E.M. Foster's famous remark, which has come to retrospectively characterize the circles of friendship that emerged in the Bloomsbury Group. I hate the idea of causes. If I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope he should have the courage to betray my country. This was published in his 1951 essay, 2 Cheers for Democracy. Worth noting here, perhaps, that the Soviet spies Anthony Blunt and Guy Burgess, who went up to Cambridge in 1926 and 1930, respectively, were also apostles. There is a tenuous Bloomsbury connection here too, as when Julian Bell, the son of Vanessa, went up to Cambridge in 1927, he was also made an apostle and taken as a lover by Anthony Blunt. But we're getting ahead of ourselves and very much off the topic. While only an occasional visitor to the places we associate with Bloomsbury, it's the philosophy of G.E. Moore which is the most influential in defining its values. He was first of all a product of the challenge to religious certainties which characterized the later years of the 19th century, and which, as we've already seen, caused Leslie Stephen to resign his teaching position at Cambridge in 1864. In 1871, religious tests for degrees were abolished, except for, of course, for degrees in divinity. And in 1882, the Oxford and Cambridge Universities Act was passed, which meant that fellows no longer needed to be ordained or celibate. Universities became open to dissenters and humanists like G.E. Moore. Philosophy, no longer called moral ethics, now had to deal with the question of what it is to lead a good life in a world where religious certainties no longer exist. Moore's response was to suggest that good could be found in such things as personal friendship and the appreciation of beautiful things. As such, he rejected the Victorian values of a life of action and public good deeds in favor of a personal, private life of the individual. In this philosophy, to quote Moore, personal affection and the appreciation of what is beautiful in art or nature are good in themselves. So what came out of it? E.M. Foster clearly shared this view of the importance of friendship, as we've already seen in the quote above. This is reflected in his 2 most famous novels, Howard's End, 1910, with its plea for us only to connect with one another, and A Passage to India, 1924, which also challenges the hypocrisy at the heart of colonialism. His novel about homosexuality, Morris, which could only be published posthumously, is a plea for honesty in sexual relationships, which again characterized the Bloomsbury Group. Interestingly, he may not have had a lot of time for causes, but his novels have arguably inspired many others to take up courses and attempt to change the world. And here's another one who changed the world. This is John Maynard Keynes, one-time lover of Duncan Grant and husband here of Lydia Lopakova, one of the principal dancers of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, whom Keynes married in 1922. Cambridge and the Bloomsbury Group thus also gave us the most influential book on economics ever written, The Economic Consequence of the Peace, which as a critique of the Versailles Treaty predicted the Second World War and inspired the Keynesian economics of Roosevelt's New Deal at the time of the Great Depression. The book was written in 1919 at Charleston, the farmhouse home of Vanessa Bell, née Stephen, where he was given a bedroom and a place to write. As a baronet and later member of the House of Lords, he would move away from Bloomsbury circles later in life, but carry their influence into the seat of power. And another product of Cambridge and Bloomsbury, Lytton Strachey, seen here in a painting by his lover, Dora Carrington. His best-selling critical biography, the heavily ironical Eminent Victorians, which we've discussed before, published in 1918, was a direct challenge to the hero worship of the Victorian icons of Cardinal Manning, Gordon of Khartoum, Florence Nightingale, and Thomas Arnold. They're not a complete hatchet job, and yet they set out to expose the prudery and hypocrisy which he saw as characterizing the age of Victoria. Now, we may challenge some of the conclusions, but we cannot but admire his willingness to challenge the conventional wisdom of the time with some wit, a good dose of irony, and not a lot of reverence. Or at least I can't anyway. For Strachey and others in the Bloomsbury Group, the Victorian past represented hypocrisy, dishonesty, bourgeois prejudice, imperialist macho warmongering, colonial self-satisfaction, pomposity, sexual timidity, and repression. In its place, they offered a philosophy of intellectual liberalism, which they saw as the antithesis of all things Victorian. His was a typical Victorian childhood, the fifth son and 11th child in a wealthy family with colonial connections. Here he is, the second from the left, with an Eton collar. 10 of the 13 children survived into adulthood, seen here in a pious pose with their parents. His father, Sir Richard, was a lieutenant general in the Indian Army, a colonial administrator, and the grandson of a baronet. His mother, Lady Strachey, on the other hand, was a feminist and a suffragette. These pictures were taken at the family mansion at Sutton Court, Stowey in Somerset. In her book on the Bloomsbury Group, Frances Spalding also includes two of Lytton's sisters as being on the fringes of the Bloomsbury set. Pippa Strachey, the lady at the back between the two men with moustaches, and Marjorie Strachey, the young girl with long hair and her back to us. Pippa, born in 1872, died in 1968, described as lively, intelligent, and sweet-tempered, was like her mother, a leader in the suffragist movement. And Marjorie, 1882 to 1964, was a writer and ran a school at Charleston Farmhouse in 1925 and 1926. Dorothy, two to the left of Pippa, married Simon Bussey, a French artist who painted many of the Bloomsbury Group and is mentioned by Angelica Bell as living near them in Gordon Square. The youngest boy in the forefront of the group is James Strachey, who born in 1887 and died in 1967. He would grow up to be a translator of Freud and, like Adrian Stephen, one of the Stephen children, a psychoanalyst. And I can't help but mention this, as it mentioned Weymouth, the same irreverence towards the Victorian values that Lytton Strachey had shown in his Eminent Victorians was also the motivation behind the famous hoax played on the Royal Navy in 1910. Virginia and Adrian Stephen and their artist friend Duncan Grant, with two others, had dressed up and presented themselves as the Abyssinian royal family to the captain of HMS Dreadnought in Weymouth Bay. For the Edwardians, the dreadnoughts were a potent symbol of imperial power and international prestige. They were welcomed on board with full military honours, were allowed to inspect the fleet, and using a language composed of mock Latin and Greek and borrowed prayer mats, bestowed some fake military honours on the officers present. Nobody suspected until the whole episode was reported in the Daily Mirror, with pictures such as this one, which you see here. Now, Virginia is seated on the left with Duncan Grant standing next to her, And Adrian is standing with a false beard and bowler hat on the back row. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. While Toby and Adrian were having the intellectual and stimulating time of their life at Cambridge, Vanessa and Virginia were back in Kensington trying to keep their father happy. Virginia, who had already studied some Greek and Latin privately began lessons in Greek history and Latin at King's College London, though at the King's Ladies Department near her home run the main campus, while Vanessa, still at her father's beck and call, had begun art lessons in 1896 and studied at the Royal Academy Schools and the Slade School of Art from 1901. Meanwhile, their half-brother, George Duckworth, had taken upon himself the role as acting head of the family, with responsibility for protecting Vanessa from Jack Hill's reciprocated affections and introducing them both to society, something they hated, and even more so when he took advantage of them himself on their return home. By 1902, Leslie Stephen was plagued with stomach pains and cancer was diagnosed. He died at home on the 22nd of February 1904 after a long illness. In the same year, Virginia suffered a second nervous breakdown and was not fully recovered until the end of the year. It has been suggested that this was triggered by the intense grief of her loss and a feeling of guilt at her impatience with the bad-tempered father at the end of his life. Meanwhile, George Duckworth married Lady Margaret Herbert. Bloomsbury was about to be born. And this is section 4 of 6, Living in Squares. While the death of Leslie Stephen hit the family hard, it was also a cause of great relief. There then followed the second most important date in the birth of Bloomsbury, early in October 1904. After a holiday in Pembrokeshire, Venice, Florence and Paris, Vanessa, Toby, Virginia and Adrian moved to the less fashionable district of Bloomsbury and found a house at 46 Gordon Square. Gordon Square and Tavistock Square, which is mentioned later, are very close to each other. And Russell Square Gardens, of course, as you know, borders the British Museum. It was here at Gordon Square that they would hold unchaperoned weekly meetings for discussion of art, literature, current affairs, philosophy, with Thursday reserved for writers and Friday for artists. Toby brought his friends from Cambridge together, and even Virginia and Vanessa were allowed to make a contribution. For Vanessa and Virginia, in particular, the move to Bloomsbury was a liberation. In the BBC miniseries Life in Squares, this is symbolized by Vanessa and Virginia ripping off their corsets and throwing them out of the windows. Maybe, unfortunately, that is apocryphal, but Virginia's words here demonstrate a rejection of the upper middle class world of Victorian values to which her parents and even the older Duckworths belonged. She wrote, "We were full of experiments and reforms. We were going to do without table napkins. We were going to paint, to write, to have coffee after dinner instead of tea at 9 o'clock. Everything was going to be new. Everything was going to be different. Everything was on trial." Gordon Square was light and airy, with garish Indian shawls thrown on the backs of chairs, a red carpet, distempered walls, and even electric light. Moreover, they were going to have garlic in their food. Virginia, to the horror of her maiden aunt, even took up smoking and began teaching evening classes at Morley College for working men and women. Even more importantly, for 46 Gordon Square, it became a focus for lively debate and discussions, which challenged the assumptions of empire and the old Victorian bourgeois moralities. They did, however, retain their servants. The Stephen family here, Vanessa and Toby on the left and Virginia and Adrian on the right, had then made a new life for themselves. In 1906, Vanessa and Virginia and her friend Violet Dickinson travelled to Greece to meet up with Adrian and Toby on holiday. Vanessa and Toby returned unwell, suffering from typhoid. On the 20th of November Toby died suddenly and unexpectedly. Yet again, their world was shattered. Within 2 days of his death, Vanessa had accepted the offer of marriage from Clive Bell, one of Toby's university friends, despite having rejected his proposal 17 months earlier. They married a year later, but after the birth of Julian, their first child, Virginia began a brief flirtation with her brother-in-law when they were all on holiday in St. Ives. It caused a temporary rift in the relationship of the two sisters, but not a lasting one. In 1911, Vanessa would later have a flirtation with another artist and critic whom she had met at the Friday Artists gatherings, Roger Fry, an apostle we have met already and will meet again. Such was the Bloomsbury way. Here, though, are the family together again, this time on Studland Beach in 1910, with a pretty impressive choice of swimwear by Virginia and Clive. At least she didn't swim naked as she would do with Rupert Brooke at Byron's Pool, Grantchester, on a moonlit night in 1911 when she had a flirtation with the neo-pagans. But we better move on from that, back to London. But back to our squares. Clive and Vanessa Bell now took over the house in Gordon Square. It would continue to be a key Bloomsbury location as the Bells' London home, though they moved within the square over time, and they'd be there for the rest of their lives. At one point, Maynard Keynes also had a flat there, and from 1909, Lytton Strachey with James Strachey and the Bussys also found a home there. Meanwhile, Virginia and Adrian had moved the short distance to Fitzroy Square, shown here on the map, to a house which had once been the home of George Bernard Shaw. One of their neighbours was the artist Duncan Grant, who lived at number 21 and had studios in numbers 8 and 22. He was introduced to the group by his cousin Lytton Strachey, with whose family he had spent time in his teenage years. And here's the close-up of the square and its leafy surroundings today. Most importantly for the story of the Bloomsbury Group, however, was that Fitzroy Square was also from 1913 to 1919 the location of the Omega workshops. This was an enterprise and a hub for modern artists set up to produce artifacts, home decor, and even clothes inspired by the work of the post-impressionists. Roger Fry, Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell were founders and directors of the firm. To understand their importance, we need to go back to the 8th of November 1910, another of those key dates in the birth of Bloomsbury, and the third of three. In or about December 1910, human character changed, wrote Virginia Woolf in her 1924 essay, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. She was referring to the first post-impressionist exhibition, Manet and the Post-Impressionists, which began at Grafton Street Galleries on the 8th of November 1910 and continued on until January the 15th, and which she saw as making a clean break with the Victorian values of her past. It created a furore in the world of art and opened the way to an age of modernism in art and literature. In 1910, Clive Bell met Roger Fry on a train between Cambridge and London and excitedly introduced him and French post-impressionism art to the Bloomsbury Group. In her essay, Virginia Woolf went on to state that this change in human character caused a domino effect. All human relations, she said, have shifted. Those between masters and servants, husbands and wives, parents and children. And when human relations change, there's at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. For them, the final nail in the Victorian coffin had been driven in. For the first time, the British public were confronted not only with the established impressionism of Manet, but also the avant-garde experiments in colour and form of artists such as Paul Cézanne, Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, Henri Matisse, and Pablo Picasso. These European artists were embraced by the Bloomsbury painters and critics. Desmond McCarthy, along with Clive Bell and Roger Fry, for example, have been charged with selecting some of the paintings to be exhibited, and he was its secretary. While the influence of the post-impressionists on the work of Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell is plain to see. It was visited by about 25,000 individuals over the course of 2 months. Visitors to the exhibition, who had only just come to terms with French Impressionism, were scandalized by the vibrant colors and the experimental forms so different from the genre paintings that they had known in their Victorian youth. At the Slade School of Art, shown here, where Vanessa had studied, along with other names associated with Bloomsbury, such as Dora Carrington and Mark Gertler, the formidable Henry Tonks forbade his students to attend. So anarchic and threatening did he see this new type of art. We can perhaps see why they were so scandalized if we compare this 1900 landscape by Henry Tonks with its Victorian sentimentality, its symbolism, and perhaps its hints of Impressionism. And if we compare that with this 1910 picture by Vincent van Gogh, which was shown at the 1910 Post-Expressionist exhibition, Crows Over a Wheat Field, which exhibited at Grafton Street. Naturalism has been replaced by vibrant colours and the exploration of deep emotions. Critics describe the 1910 paintings as bizarre, morbid, and horrible, and accuse the artists of psychological degeneracy. But rather than being deterred by such criticism, Roger Fry, with the help of Clive and Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, mounted a second exhibition in 1912. You can see the Cubist-inspired catalogue cover here on the right, designed by Roger Fry and Vanessa Bell, and drawn by Duncan Grant, showing the face of a woman with a raised hand, showing her horror at the thought of the announcement of another exhibition. The painting, A Room at the Second Post-Impressionist Exhibition, Matisse Room, was by Vanessa Bell. The exhibition included 16 paintings by Matisse, such as The Dance, which is shown here, and 6 of Picasso's Cubist works, such as Flaco et Livre, Bottle and Books, shown here. The exhibition evoked the same outrage. Leonard Woolf, as secretary of the exhibition, wrote, "Every now and then, some well-groomed, red-faced gentleman, oozing the undercut of the best beef and the most succulent of chops, carrying his top hat and grey suede gloves, would come up to my table and abuse the pictures and me with the greatest rudeness." Despite this, these exhibitions would open the doors to abstract art, lead to Clive Bell's theory of significant form, published in his book Art in 1914, and itself, influenced by the philosophy of G. Moore, even lead to the experimental novels of Virginia Woolf. And where was Virginia Woolf when all this was going on? In 1911, Adrian and Virginia had moved from Fitzroy Street to another square nearby, Brunswick Square, near the site of the Foundling Hospital. This would be, for a time, become the locus for the Bloomsbury Group. This house was shared with 3 other men. That's a lie, with 2 other men, Duncan Grant and Maynard Keynes, who had previously lived together in Fitzroy Square. On the ground floor was Duncan and Maynard, Adrian on the first floor, Virginia on the second floor, and Leonard on the third. Shockingly for her stepbrother and elderly relatives, she was unchaperoned, but her witty response to their objections was that if anything untoward did happen, the Foundling Hospital was on the doorstep. On the 11th of August 1912, Virginia and Leonard married at St. Pancras Registry Office. He had first admired her as a young beauty when he had first seen her visiting Toby in Cambridge, then met again in Gordon Square in 1911 when he was on leave from his post as a colonial administrator in Ceylon. And when he returned from Ceylon in January 1912, he proposed to her and she accepted. By then, she had turned down 3 other proposals of marriage, including one from Lytton Strachey. She referred to Leonard as a penniless Jew. Casual anti-Semitism was unfortunately one of her traits. but she would rely on him all her life and find support and stability despite more periods of breakdown, depression, and attempted suicide, through which he managed and nursed her for the rest of her life. They took rooms in Clifford's Inn, which is between Lincoln's Inn and Blackfriars, before moving out of London to the quieter suburbs of Richmond-on-Thames in Surrey and south of the river in 1915. And that's their house there. Here she began to write and revise her first novel, The Voyage Out, while continuing to work as a literary reviewer. In 1917, Leonard purchased a small printing press, partly to give her something distracting to do. They began by printing pamphlets and a pair of short stories, Three Jews by Leonard Woolf and The Mark on the Wall by Virginia Woolf. They had written them themselves, but from these modest beginnings would grow the Hogarth Press. By March 1924, Virginia was well enough to move back to Bloomsbury, though from 1916 the Woolfs also had a place to retreat to in the Sussex countryside. The Hogarth Press came with them and expanded, while Virginia continued to write novels, essays, and reviews. Throughout her lifetime, Virginia Woolf published 9 novels, 5 collections of short stories, 1 play, over 500 essays, reviews, letters, and diaries, and arguably never wrote a bad line, even while writing a suicide note. Her first published piece of writing was an article on the Brontes, which appeared in The Guardian on the 21st of December 1904. While her first 2 novels, The Voyage Out and Night and Day, were first published by her half-brother, George Duckworth. The other 6 and the majority of her essays were published first by the Hogarth Press and with dust covers, as here, designed by her sister Vanessa. 2 of her most famous novels, To the Lighthouse, 1927, and Mrs. Dalloway, 1925, and 2 of her most influential essays, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, 1924, and A Room of One's Own, 1929, are illustrated here. Arguably, it will be for her criticism that she'll be remembered, especially for her defense of feminism in A Room of One's Own, and the defense of the experimental novels in Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. But the 2 novels illustrated here are her finest. Rather than following the pattern of a traditional narrative, she gets inside of the minds of her characters, and like a cubist painter, shows us multiple perspectives and multiple independent minds. As for example, when in Mrs. Dalloway, she shows the inner life of Clarissa Dalloway, married to an MP, or Septimus Smith, the World War I veteran, suffering still from shell shock, who eventually kills himself. William James, the brother of American author and friend of Leslie Stephen, coined the term stream of consciousness to describe this sort of novel, but novels of multiple consciousnesses would be more accurate. She was here trying to bring to the novel what post-impressionism had brought to art. It was originally called The Hours, hence the film of that name, where Nicole Kidman plays Virginia Woolf. I must draw your attention, by the way, to something I like, which is the very clever Hogarth Press logo, which looks like a cross between a wolf, nice pun there, and a printing press right at the bottom. While Virginia Woolf was famous for turning down the publication of another experimental novel, James Joyce's Ulysses, out of snobbery perhaps, as she regarded Joyce's underbred, that's her word, that's vulgar. Coincidentally, they were born and died in the same year, and regarded it as the work of a queasy undergraduate scratching his pimples. She did recognize the genius of T.S. Eliot, being the first to publish The Wasteland. She published Catherine Mansfield's work, despite the jealousy she said she felt for her writing. And she published the first complete translation of Sigmund Freud's complete works, translated by Anna Freud and James Strachey. Virginia Woolf is also credited with being the co-translator of Dostoevsky's The Devils, or The Possessed, which was published by the Hogarth Press in 1922. Her house in Tavistock Square is no longer there, having been bombed and destroyed during the war. but the Tavistock Hotel now stands where once the bright yellow walls and post-impressionist murals by Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell were there to greet the firemen in the aftermath of the bombing raid. In the gardens opposite, though, is a copy of the famous bronze bust of her by Stephen Tomlin and a ginkgo biloba tree from Leonard Woolf's Ceylon. And if we're going to finish off the squares, we might as well have a look at Woolf's final London square was that at Mecklenburgh Square, a short walk from Brunswick Square and an even shorter walk from Dickens Museum in Gower Street. This was also bombed during the war, but where 37 Mecklenburgh Square once stood, there's now William Goodenough College, where I'm pleased to say I have stayed on several occasions when looking for cheap central London accommodation. And if it's good enough for me, why not? And we're on section 5 already. This, unfortunately, for those who are, is the longest section. It's called Bloomsbury Spreads Its Wings. So out there on the fringes of Bloomsbury, or the Bloomsbury Group, was another locus of London's intellectual and artistic elite, Lady Ottoline Morell, the extravagant and larger-than-life society hostess who would have entertained members of the Bloomsbury Group, as well as others, at her home in Bedford Square. Though she's more often associated with Garsington, in the Oxford countryside. That's her mansion home. Here with Virginia Woolf and Lytton Strachey in the picture. It should also be remembered that when during the First World War, conscientious objectors needed to find government-approved work, she employed Clive Bell on one of her farms there. She's also perhaps best remembered as the model for Hermione Rodici in Women in Love, and perhaps even Lady Chatterley, both of which portrayals ended her close friendship with D.H. Lawrence, who, as you can probably expect, didn't have a lot of time for Bloomsbury anyway. Another society host with claims to be considered a member of the Bloomsbury Group was the popular Edwardian writer and society hostess, Vita Sackville-West. She was married to the politician and diplomat Harold Nicholson, famous as the man tasked with the duty of handing Britain's declaration of war to the German ambassador on the 4th of August 1914. He was the most junior member of the department. Like Vita, he had affairs with people of the same sex, but unlike Vita, they would never be as frequent or intense. Her 1918-20 relationship with Violet Trefusis has been well documented by her son Nigel Nicholson in his book A Portrait of a Marriage, which has subsequently been turned into a film of the same name. Someone who fell under her spell and fell passionately in love was Virginia Woolf. Their relationship was at its most passionate between 1924 and 1928. They had met 2 years earlier at a party given by Clive Bell, and their friendship would continue long after their affair was over. Virginia visited her at her expansive ancestral home of Knowle, which has got 365 rooms, which is a nice number of rooms, isn't it? One for each day of the year, which is, she visited it there, but it's of interest because Vita was unable to inherit it because of her gender. She visited Long Barn in Sevenoaks, where Harold Nicholson and Vita had moved to, and the restored gardens and castle of Sissinghurst, where they then moved on to. In 1928, Orlando was published about a transgender protagonist, beginning as a 16-year-old boy in the age of Elizabeth, who is reborn as a woman and who, unlike Vita, does end up inheriting Knowle. It was illustrated with pictures of Vita in various historical costumes. Nigel Nicholson, her youngest son, called it a love letter to his mother, and so it was. And then if we're talking about Bloomsbury outposts, what about Lytton Strachey, another bisexual member of the Bloomsbury Group, who again illustrates the description of Bloomsbury made by Dorothy Parker of people who loved in triangles. The unrequited love of his life was Ralph Partridge, pictured here. He's seated on the left, who worked for the Woolfs at the Hogarth Press, but who married the artist Dora Carrington, who was herself madly in love with Lytton Strachey. So much so that when Lytton Strachey died of stomach cancer in 1932, Dora Carrington went and got a shotgun and shot herself and killed herself. This picture was taken at Ham Spray in Wiltshire when the three of them were living happily together. Perhaps Dora's happiest years, though, were when she lived here at Tidmarsh Mill in Goring, near Reading, with Lytton Strachey between 1917 and 1924. This again became a meeting place for the members of the Bloomsbury Group, and the painting on the left is by her, and the one on the right is a photograph. It was, however, the Sussex homes of Virginia and Vanessa which have the strongest claims for keeping the Bloomsbury flame alive outside London. It was not unusual for wealthy people to have a home in London and a home in the countryside, and given Virginia's nervous disposition, it was particularly important for her to have a place to retreat to. She first visited the South Downs in 1910 with her brother Adrian and fell in love with it. At first, she rented a house in the village of Firle, which she called Little Talland House. Then in 1912, she and Vanessa leased Asham House, a small regency house outside of Lewes, which is shown here. It was to be the setting for her short story called Haunted House, because she believed it was. The painting was by Frederick James Porter, which I've not shown you, so I don't know why I'm telling you that. But it's one which she kept in a house in Monk's House for the rest of her life. So let's get on to Monk's House. If there's one Sussex home we associate with Virginia Woolf, it's Monk's House, in the village of Rodmell, and now in the care of the National Trust. In August 1919, the Woolfs bought the weatherboarded 18th century cottage known as Monk's House in the village of Rodmell in Sussex, and moved in on the 1st of September 1919. While at first this was their holiday home for Christmas, Easter and summer, it became increasingly used as a retreat from London and their near permanent home during the Second World War. When they moved in, Virginia noted that there were no buses, no water, no gas or electricity. There was, however, the tranquility she needed to write, except perhaps for the church bells and the children's voices from the school nearby. Here, there is their sitting room. The famous bust of Virginia by Stephen Tomlin is on the windowsill of the next room, the dining room. She was such an impatient sitter that it took over 6 years to complete, and in fact was never finished. And here's their dining room with a painted tabletop and chairs designed by Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell in about 1932, who lived at a farmhouse only 8 miles away. Note the personalized VW logo and the painted table. And this is Virginia Woolf's bedroom, entered by an outside door. Originally, this was to have been her writing studio, but she liked its lightness and airiness so much that she turned it into a bedroom instead. Before the writing lodge was built in the garden, she would often write in bed with the board stretched across her lap. Note the fireplace with tiles designed by Vanessa Bell, with its poignant painting of the boat and lighthouse, of course, and the bookshelves with books she covered herself with coloured paper. In 1928, she wrote her essay entitled A Room of One's Own, at a time when she was having this room constructed on the side of the house. Here she famously said that a writer needs a room of one's own and £500, the equivalent of £32,000 today. Quite obviously that much, because it's just enough to live on and to maintain 2 servants. That's something I'm sure we all now have. The well-tended garden was Leonard's domain, but is now more often visited to see the writing shed that Virginia had constructed. It was famously untidy, as Lytton Strachey observed, so that every surface was littered with filth packets, pen nibs, cigarette ends, and scraps of writing. For much of the time, Vanessa Bell and her children were living only 8 miles away, and so they would have frequently visited each other. Virginia was a favourite aunt who enjoyed playing, joking, and having games with them, while Leonard was the setter of boundaries that they never really received from their own parents. As an outpost of Bloomsbury, the Woolfs also received visitors, such as the Maynard and Lydia Keens, the Sackville Wests, Ethel Smythe, the famous composer and suffragette who took a liking to Virginia, Lytton Strachey, E.M. Foster, and here my favourite, T.S. Eliot. This, though, is perhaps one of the saddest pictures, as it shows his first wife, Vivian, who suffered from mental health problems and a sense of class inferiority, which I think is reflected in this monk's house photograph as he stands back. They raised money so that T.S. Eliot could give up his banking job, she and Lady Ottiline Morell, but he turned them down. Virginia also had to struggle with her demons. In March 1941, she'd become ill with anxiety and depression. She and Leonard had watched the Battle of Britain over the Sussex Downs and knew that as Leonard was both a Jew and an intellectual, they would have been among the first to be arrested if the Germans had invaded. And in fact, they were on Himmler's list. On March the 28th, she wrote an exonerating, loving note for her sister Vanessa and for Leonard, walked down to the river, filled her pockets with heavy stones and waded in. Her body was found in the River Ouse 3 weeks later on the 18th of April. She was cremated 3 days later, and her ashes were scattered in the garden near where the statue now stands. Beneath is her epitaph taken from the final lines of her novel, The Waves, which reads, "Death is the enemy. Against you I will fling myself unvanquished and unyielding, O death. The waves broke on the shore." Leonard would live on until 1969, and his ashes are beside hers. Her last novel, Between the Acts, was published posthumously on the 17th of July, 1941. Only 8 miles away, near Firle in West Sussex, was the Charleston Farmhouse home of her sister, Vanessa Bell. Virginia herself had made her aware of its availability and, as I said, was a frequent visitor. Today it looks idyllic and is the go-to place for fans of Bloomsbury, with its gardens and pond and flowers and beautiful rooms. And here's another view looking over the pond. In 1916, while still retaining a house in London, Vanessa, 8-year-old Julian, 6-year-old Quentin, Duncan Grant, and David Bunny Garnett, he always wore a coat made of rabbit fur, so he's obviously going to be called Bunny, moved into this farmhouse, whose oldest parts were Elizabethan and much in need of repair. The main reason for this was that it offered an opportunity for the two men, both conscientious objectors, to find farm work. They had previously worked on a farm in Suffolk. So they worked from 12 hours a day, pulling up vegetables and digging and coming home with calluses on their hand. The two pictures here of Vanessa and Duncan Grant are self-portraits. Vanessa was very much in love with Duncan Grant, while Duncan Grant, who had already had affairs with Adrian Stephen, Lytton Strachey, and Maynard Keynes, was very much in love with Bunny Garnett. Homosexuality at the time was illegal and would remain so until 1967, when the hastily rushed through Criminal Law Act of 1885, known as the Labouche Amendment, was repealed. It was under this act that Oscar Wilde had been convicted in 1895 and had subsequently spent 2 years in prison. One of the central beliefs of the Bloomsbury Group was that honesty in all things was of paramount importance, and this extended as much to sexual relationships as to matters of politics or religion. This is why they loved in triangles, to quote Dorothy Parker again. This ménage à trois seems to have worked well if these two paintings of that time by Duncan Grant are anything to go by. On the left, Bunny Garnett is shown translating Dostoevsky into English. His mother Constance is shown, his mother Constance, born in 1841, was the foremost translator of Russian literature in this country, and his father was a reader and publisher. while the painting on the left shows Vanessa painting while David Garnett is writing. And that was my favorite painting at the recent Duncan Grant exhibition at Charleston. Bunny Garnett was also a novelist and most famous for writing Aspects of Love in the 1950s, which was turned into an Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, and in Dorset for his novel The Sailor's Return, set in the pub of the same name in Chaldon Herring, also where Stephen Tomlin lived for a time. This web of relationships, however, was complicated, and complicated by the birth of Angelica Bell on Christmas Day 1918. She was the child of Vanessa and Duncan Grant, but grew up believing that she was the daughter of Clive Bell, who seems to have been more paternal than Duncan could ever be. If that was not complicated enough, on the day that Angelica was born, David Garnett was present and shortly after wrote to a friend, "I think I'm of marrying it. When she's 20, I shall be 46. Will it be scandalous?" In May 1942, when Angelica was 24 and David Garnett 50, he did marry her. He had begun an affair with Angelica in 1938 while his wife was still alive. She died of breast cancer in 1940. And literary detectives will be interested to know that he first took advantage of Angelica in a spare bedroom in the house of H.G. Wells. There are two very good books I'd recommend for the inside story of the Bloomsbury Group from a children's perspective. There's Quentin Bell's Bloomsbury, which is 1968, and Deceived by Kindness by Angelica Bell in 1984. And what of Clive Bell? Despite his marriage to Vanessa proving to be unsuccessful, he kept on good terms with Vanessa, would frequently visit Charleston with a mistress in tow, and took up residence there in 1939. He also continued to have rooms in Gordon Square and would take Vanessa and the children to Cleve House, the family home at Seend in Wiltshire. It's thanks to his money, inherited from a wealthy mining family, that Vanessa and Duncan were able to continue living at Charleston. The painting of Duncan and Clive enjoying a sociable evening together at Charleston over a glass of wine, date unknown, is by Vanessa Bell. And here he is earlier with Roger Fry and Duncan Grant witnessing Lytton Strachey's getting a haircut sometime in the 1920s. When Clive Bell returned to Charleston to live in 1939 because of the war, he would have found it overflowing with the art of Vanessa and Duncan on every available surface. Here is Clive's bedroom and bathroom. This covering of every surface with paint can be overwhelming, but it's very much in keeping with the Omega workshops of 1913 and the philosophy of G.E. Moore. Art, they believed, did not belong only on a canvas and behind a picture frame. Rather, they believed that the celebration and joy of art should extend into every part of our lives. As G.E. Moore said, the appreciation of what is beautiful in art or nature are good in themselves. And here, a picture of Duncan Grant's studio. You may recognize the mantelpiece from the opening slide. And the same from another angle. And here's the detail of the mantelpiece, which you've seen already as the opening slide for this presentation. Note the pictures of Angelica on the left and the Victorian Vanessa among the ceramics and above the nude male figures. I wish I'd worked out who the newspaper cutting was. That looks to me like Maynard Keynes in the book, but I can't be certain of that. Some of you may know. Another room was within the house. This is the garden room within the house. Notice how every surface seems to be covered in paint, or that they have paint on the paintings hanging up. So this is the garden room. Vanessa decorated Duncan's bedroom, shown here, and he would decorate hers. My favorite room, though, is this one, which is the dining room. And here, Vanessa would have reigned supreme. And you can actually see the place on the table, which is a little more worn, where she would have sat. With the ceramics and light shades by Quentin Bell, the table and chairs straight out of the on-the-go workshop and made for them. And a little close-up of the wallpaper. The wallpaper in this room is seen here with hand painted by Duncan, Vanessa and Angelica in 1939. And then there's the artwork. This is back to Duncan Grant's studio. Here are two pictures of the pond at Charleston. One is in a private collection, the one on the top left-hand corner, by Duncan Grant's 1943 Pond in Winter. But the other one is the more abstract 1916 version, hangs at Charleston in Duncan Grant's studio. And this was probably the first painting that Vanessa ever did when she came to Charleston. And here are two portraits of Vanessa Bell, painted by Duncan Grant at Charleston. But finally, if we're talking about the paintings, we can move out of Charleston to a church 3 miles away to see some paintings which Vanessa, Duncan and Angelica and Quentin performed there as a commission. They're in the church of St. Michael's and All Angels, 3 miles from Charleston. Despite being agnostic and humanist all their lives, they were given a commission by Bishop Bell of Chichester to decorate this local church, which is a good place to see their work close up. This was begun in 1941 and even includes a mural of the Supper of Emmaus by Quentin Bell with Leonard Woolf as the model for Christ. It's not shown here. Here we see Angelica Bell as the model for the angel Gabriel in the Annunciation and for Mary in the nativity scene. The kneeling figure with the lamp is based on Duncan Grant, and the children are those of the housekeeper and the gardener at Charleston. The two men in the background, by the way, between them had two arms. They were both they'd both lost an arm, and were local people. Notice also the soldiers who are kneeling, who are local figures before the figure of Christ, which isn't shown here. The baby is said to resemble Julian in the nativity, who'd been killed aged 29 while driving an ambulance for the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War in 1937, a tragedy from which Vanessa never really recovered, and which must have been very much on her mind when painting here. I do recommend you go and see Berwick Church if you're down in Sussex. Vanessa died in 1961, Duncan in 1978, Quentin Bell in 1996, and Angelica in 2012. Duncan and Vanessa are buried side by side, not at the Berwick Church, but at St. Peter's, Firle, which was their parish church, with Angelica appropriately at their feet. It could be said that Bloomsbury died with them, but really it had run its course by the outbreak of war in 1939. Pacifism was no longer accepted as legitimate in the face of the Nazi terror, and both the philosophy of G. Moore and the critical theory of Clive Bell and Roger Fry had fallen out of fashion. Yet arguably, this movement that began as a reaction to Victorianism has left a legacy which is with us today. And the final short section is the Bloomsbury legacy. So, what in the words of Monty Python has Bloomsbury ever done for us? Well, let's first of all get a negative in from my own prejudice. Firstly, it didn't completely throw off the legacy of the Victorian era. The Wolves, the Bells and the Strakeys still relied on servants to the end of their lives, as pictured here. But in terms of their legacy, they did leave us the novels, literary criticism, essays, diaries, letters of Virginia Woolf, who became something of a, after going out of fashion in the 1950s, became something of a feminist icon in the 1970s. And in her life, she did show that mental health need not define a person. Secondly, there's the art that the Bloomsbury Group gave us. Here are two portraits of Virginia Woolf by her sister Vanessa, the one on the left in 1934 at Tavistock House, and the more abstract one on the right in 1912. And as for a painting, and it's getting even more abstract in this painting of Studland Beach by Vanessa Bell, also in 1912. Arguably, without the Bloomsbury Group and their promotion of significant form over narrative, we would never have seen modern art. Then there was the contribution to contemporary thought made by these three, who we mentioned earlier, E.M. Forster and also known as Morgan Foster, J.M. Keynes and Lytton Strachey. Finally, as the whole justification for this talk on this forum is to suggest that without the age of Victoria, Bloomsbury would never have existed. Its legacy must also include challenging some of the dishonesty which arguably underpinned Victorian society, as Holman Hunt was doing earlier in this painting of 1853, The Awakening Consciousness. Bloomsbury challenged the prejudices about women, about gay, lesbian and bisexual people, about the individual's right to choose. Because they were close to people in power, they made bohemianism, and because they were never going to die in poverty, they made bohemianism and radical ways of thinking respectable. And as such, they act as a bridge between the age of Victoria and ourselves. The gay people there in the 1920s are Dora Carrington and Stephen Tomlin. I'm not sure who's in the middle of the ladder there, but they're the important ones. And finally, let's end with a quote. I'll leave the last word to Virginia Woolf. When she was trying to define what Bloomsbury had achieved, she wrote this. There was a letter to Gwen Raverett, whose husband was a painter, on the 1st of May 1925, about Bloomsbury. Where they seemed to me to triumph is in having worked out a view of life which was not by any means corrupt or sinister or merely intellectual, rather ascetic and austere indeed, which still holds and keeps them dining together and staying together after 20 years. And no amount of quarrelling or success or failure has altered this. Now, I do think that this is rather creditable. In the end, then, it comes down to the celebration of friendship, the search for knowledge and good discussion, just the sort of thing that this group themselves set out to achieve. So thank you for listening.